beautiful East Tennessee in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. You are listening to the Sherry Voluntary Show, and I do appreciate you spending your time with me. My guest today is someone I'm really super excited to have, and I've been kind of following for a while and really excited about what he's done, and because I think it speaks to a huge segment of the American population and the population of the world as well. And so my guest is Mr. Raeford Davis, and you may have heard of him. He is an ex-police officer who is now a voluntarist. So we're going to get into a little bit about how that happens and some other things with him. So Raeford, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Sherry. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I figure with a name like Raeford, it's got to be Southern.
Yeah.
Are you Southern?
That's right. Hey, I was raised named after my grandfather, who grew up with Jesse Helms. Remember Senator?
Really?
Senator Helms from North Carolina,
the ex-KKK guy.
That's my lineage, and where I come from. Christian, conservative, Deep South. Folks.
Right. Like, so did you grow up Democrat?
No. I guess,
okay.
Republican. Consider myself like a compassionate conservative.
Okay. The George W. type?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was a W supporter back in the day too, before my life transformed. I thought he was just a great guy. I thought he was a conservative. Well, even then, though, I would say he's not really a conservative, but I like him, right? He's my guy. He's a Republican. So, and I always felt, for years, I felt like the Republican Party left me. Not that I left the Republicans, and that was the case, but I'm really thankful that they did. It's like when you're in an abusive relationship and that person gets tired of beating you, so they leave, and then you're actually better off. It's great. So. But, so I wanted to get into a little bit about, you personally. And so you were a police officer for, was it 6 years?
Yeah, I was a cop, in the city of North Charleston, South Carolina, a population of 80,000, a working class, city, high crime. We were the 8th most dangerous city at the time, and with 300-man police force, and we were very proactive. Our main mission was like get guns and drugs off the streets. And, I signed up because, I wanted to help my community, just like, a lot of cops do. I had family that was in law enforcement, and so, you be a teacher or, go into medicine. What do you do? Well, I want to be a cop.
Right.
And I always kind of figured myself, like I said, I was conservative, but also kind of compassionate. So I thought I had a really good understanding of right and wrong and the Constitution, and get out there and and also to kind of prove myself a little bit. How cops do. You want to get in that kind of that line of fire, and you see the movies and all where you go in there and sacrifice yourself. I don't want to get killed or anything.
Right.
You go in there and put yourself at risk to do those hard jobs that other people won't do in order to protect, the less fortunate in the community. And that's where most cops, that's what their mindset is. We did a lot of good work. We also had, a lot of crime. But I saw that a lot of what we did, was just very counterproductive. I didn't. And in a lot of it, just kind of morally did not sit right with me. We're arresting people for, possessing a gun or drugs or, suspended driver's license, all this other stuff. And it just like, exactly what crime are these folks committing again? When we would write up the police report, you'd have to put it in the computer system. It's one of the first things, even when I was in training. And I did my first drug arrest. And I'm asking my FTO, my field training officer, so you would have to list a victim, suspect, victim, or the computer would not validate your report writing. And so I'm like, well, who do I put for the victim for this drug arrest? And they're like, well, you put society and list the city hall's address.
Oh, gee.
So here we are. We had to trick the computer in order to make this arrest. And I was gung ho. I figured that and there again, real crime, neighborhoods begging us, please do something. We got these drug dealers on our streets. They're thuggish scumbags. And if we even complain, they'll shoot at our house. I mean, it's just hard, really tough stuff. And so you're like, man, we need to get out here and really get tough. But I saw that one, it wasn't working. I mean, we all knew that. And also, I just saw that again, what we were doing, while legally justifiable, we kind of were the vicious gang just as well. And it really caused a harassment. Now I got out of policing. I was injured. I was directing traffic, got hit by a truck.
Oh my gosh. And that's terrible. I'm sorry.
Yes. So broke my leg, didn't heal back right. And so that's why I got out. I'm not disgruntled with policing. I loved it. But I knew it wasn't working. And I worked in detective division as well for a little bit with child abuse and child sexual assault. So there was real crimes. I tried to get out of the whole drug business, not because I was this huge legalized drugs kind of person as a cop, but I knew it wasn't right. Mm-hmm. And so let me go where there's real victims. And then I went in there where we had real victims. And guess what? How we dealt with them was just not acceptable. Right. And it was just the entire system. It wasn't us personally, but we had real victims that justice was not served by them. And then we also, and this really personally disturbed me, was we arrested people that were almost certainly innocent. Mm-hmm. And we would just run them through this crucible. And that was one of the last things where my injury was not healing, and I had no choice but to get out because of that. But one of the last cases where there was a guy, and it was just convoluted, accusations of child abuse and child sexual assault that frankly, I was not confident in the facts of the case. Mm-hmm. And we're talking over with my supervisor about this. And I'm like, look, if I was on the jury, I would not convict this man. And I know this case better than anyone, which is not very much at all. And they're like, charge him anyway. And so I felt, I was like, geez, I felt personally responsible for that.
Yeah.
And that's when I was like, you know what, I can't take it anymore. I got to get out.
Yeah, that's a lot of people don't understand that relationship between like the DA and the police, that DAs are most often elected officials, and they have to look tough on crime. And so they need you to make charges, and they need to look like they're doing something, whether it's actually effective or not. I don't think the state really cares that much. It just looks like you're doing something, and it protects them. And then that's another thing that I think people get confused with, is that the victim is the state. When you go into a courtroom, it's you versus the state. So they are the ones, they're saying they've been victimized by you doing something with your own body, which is utterly ridiculous. But I do think you're right, in something that you said earlier, that the intentions of most people who go into policing are good. This is where people get a little upset sometimes because, you say something like, well, there are no good cops. And they think that's you saying, well, you hate cops. And that's, for me, I have to explain, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that there are no moral agents acting for someone else. You can't give away your moral agency and obey things that aren't right. Like you were saying, arresting innocent people you knew didn't do anything. And then make that your job. Like, the person may not be a terrible person, but their job it's a wrong job. And even if we were to have our way, right, and there was this libertarian society, we would still need investigators. There's still going to be policing to be done, but it's going to be on a totally different level. And so it would be things that actually need to be done, not, preying on people for speeding or preying on people for smoking a plant or doing something, having sex for money. None of those things would rate as crimes because they're consensual and they're voluntary. And so I think that's a good distinction to be made, because I think I don't know about you, but for myself, I get riled up and I'll be like, there just aren't any good cops. And maybe that's not helpful.
And it wasn't until I really got out of policing and found people, like, Murray Rothbard and kind of that, and that type to, talking about, the non-aggression principle. That really resonated with me. It's never okay to initiate violence or physical force against another person, only to protect yourself from if someone attacks you.
Right.
Then you can use physical force. And so that's the difference between what we call like mala prohibita and mala in se crimes, where we have murder, rape, robbery, assault. At least that's an actual violent crime.
Right.
And so in a very basic format, it would be morally consistent to handcuff someone or arrest them based on those type of crimes. Now, when you have a crime like drug possession or prostitution, where you have adult consensual activity in use and trade, I don't agree with those two activities very much. But if that's what you want to do, you can't resort to violence to interfere with that. And that's what I did as a cop, is I would put handcuffs on people. Mm-hmm. And even when I did it real nice, it's still with that gun on my hip and that threat of violence.
Yes.
And so that's where I would violate that non-aggression principle. And this is where I really am kind of so adamant is with this is because, well, cops victimize people unnecessarily. And this is me talking to my own people in my own tribe as a former law enforcement, and me as being a member of that thin blue line and whatever you want to call it, is I'm talking to them, because when you harm someone unjustly, even if it's legally, when you harm someone, you violate that non-aggression principle, and that's the same as love thy neighbor.
Yeah, and
you have that moral burden. You injure your own moral fiber, your own spirituality, and so you're harming yourself. And so that's when I'm talking to cops so much, and why I'm so passionate about this, and why I'm, I do say, hey, you are not the good guys here.
Yeah.
Is really, I'm trying to look out for them, because they harm themselves morally and spiritually, and then and be part of that entire system. That's that failure of what you talk about, like voluntarism or anarchy, is because we look at a government and say, well, as long as the government says it's okay, then I'm not responsible for any harm. And that's a lie, and that's a big fraud. Mm-hmm. And that is what I speak out against, because cops harm themselves.
Right. I think that's most people in our country equate legality and morality. Like, if it's legal, it must be okay.
Right.
And really, there's no equality there. Like, just because something's legal doesn't make it okay. I mean, we know about all the slavery was legal, right? That doesn't make it okay. So, that is something that I always present to people that I'm talking with about this subject. And it's one that they really can't get around. And it comes down to, well, I just don't like it. Like you were saying with prostitution or drugs, they often take the point that if you say, well, that's a consensual act between two adults, so why should the state interject itself in that? They think you're saying, oh, you just want prostitutes on your corner, you want prostitutes. No, or you want women to be in prostitution. Well, no, I'm not making a judgment on whether that activity is good or bad. What I'm saying is that there's a judgment to be made on its harm to me. Just
right.
like
now,
with,
I would make a judgment, about it personally.
Right.
But the question becomes, what is your response? And you also have to make judgments on your response, and to use violence, and this is, I pulled people from their cars, shoved guns in their faces. I pulled them out of their home, shoved a gun in their face, and threw them on the ground. And I took their hands and I put them behind their back, and I put those handcuffs on nice and tight. And I took their belongings from them, and I shoved them in cages because of adult consensual activity.
Yeah.
And that is wrong. So that drug abuse, that prostitution, that may be their sin, but that violence was my sin. And again, the laws, if, any law that is not consistent with moral or natural law is an unjust law. And it's not just the law. The law is just a piece of paper. It is that choice of that specific officer. And this is why even people get upset a little bit when I don't blame politicians enough or whatever, and I really target cops.
Right.
And they're like, hey, these are the lowest guys on the totem pole. Why are you attacking them? Well, for two reasons. It's them that bring the harm of any unjust law into physical manifestation. Laws don't enforce themselves. They're just pieces of paper. Politicians, yeah, they've got their own responsibilities, but it's not them going out there and putting handcuffs on people.
If you wouldn't do it, they couldn't enforce it because they're not going to get their hands dirty for sure.
Right. They don't. I think that's intentional to shield themselves from the moral consequences they know that come. So they trick other people into doing it. Yeah. And they specifically trick what I call, good men and women to, in the military and in law enforcement to perpetuate these unjust harms on their behalf. And that way, those politicians and these leaders, they kind of shield themselves from some of that harm, that culpability. And so I direct it at the cops because it's you. It's you that makes that choice. You're like, well, I have to follow orders. Okay, well, then you just chose.
Right.
You chose. And they are put in a bad spot.
Yeah.
You really are. But there you are.
Yeah,
and you got to make that decision because you have that culpability. You can't shed that. Again, like you said, that moral agency, you can't push that away.
Yeah, it doesn't. You can't delegate that to someone else.
You can't delegate it to someone else. And then also, again, that's my people, is that those frontline cops and those street cops. I frankly expect more from them because, I expect more integrity from them. I don't expect anything from politicians. I know they're mostly scumbags.
Right. So, yeah, I can tell someone to, give them money and say, hey, go murder my husband. I'm still responsible. And so is the person who actually did it. There's a lot of responsibility to go around. And you're not saying that it's only cops, but you hear this argument. I happen to know a lot of police officers. My best friend of 28 years now. A few years ago, I think we're friends still. I don't know. But, he's had a few problems with some of the things I've said about policing, because he became a cop about 4 or 5 years ago now. And, I started addressing that. It's about the time I became an anarchist. So it's a pretty interesting dynamic. But one of the things he had said to me is, well, you have to blame the politicians. I'm just doing my job. And I said, well, aren't you telling me then that you will follow any order you're given, whether it's good or bad or right or wrong? Like, you're telling me right now that you're a person who is willing to follow an order in the line of, doing your job, no matter what it is. You just told me that by saying, well, blame them because I'm just doing my job so they can make any law they want and you're going to do. And he got kind of angry with me about that. But, that is the case, that you can't delegate your moral agency. So therefore, any action you take, you still are responsible for that. And their responsibility lies on them, like you said. But I think that's a really important point to make, is that, people do it with soldiers all the time too. Well, I don't like the war, but I support the troops. You can't do both. Like, they're the ones making the war. Like, they've been told to go there. They signed a piece of paper, but if it's the wrong thing to do, then they should stay and take, fight that battle, as if they're moral agents, if they really feel, they've had a change of heart or whatever, and they recognize now that it's not the right thing to do. Then the right thing isn't to go, it's to fight it. So, I don't know. When you get in situations, it's a little.
I completely agree. And see, with cops, they get mixed in because, again, there is actually like real crime, and you do some real work, and so it gets all mixed together.
Yeah, and
but you've got to ask those questions. And, when is it okay to use force against another man? And fundamentally, it is never okay to initiate that violence. And so we have an entire society based on that coercion. And how do you deal? You say, well, we talk about drugs and all this other stuff. How would you deal with that, in an anarchist society? Well, with persuasion.
Right.
And persuasion and coercion are not the same thing. And so you can do that. You can ostracize people. You can not do business with them.
And
you can choose to not have them come into your house.
I think people underestimate the value of, there's a lot of moving parts. So it's a lot to think about in every, So I think they underestimate the fact that if there's no government, there's no social system that's going to take care of these people when they make those choices. So they're more responsible for their choices. Like I always tell people, I believe in radical freedom, and that is very true. It's radical freedom. I believe in actual freedom, but I also believe in radical personal responsibility, which means you are responsible for your actions. So if you do drugs and don't work, you're going to starve, right? Or your family's going to feed you something, but that's their burden if they want to do that. But there's not going to be this social system. So there's not going to be these incentives to do that. The incentives are removed. And
a lot of it is, yes.
Yeah. So, that doesn't mean that the drug problem is going to go away, but I think it would be a lot better. You'd see a lot more people, like with kids. I always tell people, you don't make kids responsible by giving them no responsibility. As a parent, my job is to give my children responsibility as they're able to handle it and then hand it off to them. My 8-year-old, I do a lot more policing, if you will, of her than I do of my 16-year-old. He basically runs his life. He's still in my home and I kind of oversee that and guide him, but I don't tell him to brush his teeth and to comb it. He's 16 years old. He knows how to do those things. I've relinquished that responsibility. It is no longer my job, and it's not my job to inhibit him from, or to tell him to, brush his teeth. He should know how to do that. So
really, you don't threaten him with arrest if he doesn't brush his teeth?
You're going to the rape cage,
really?
Son. I do threaten him when he does things like play Toby Keith or hang. He ordered a communist flag and hung it over my bed once. He loves to troll me, so funny guy. But, that's how you teach people to be responsible, is you give them responsibility. So if he stays up all night, he's going to have a hard time getting up and going to school he homeschools, but doing school and work and everything else. Yeah, so.
You instill virtue and ethics into people.
Right.
You don't create a coercive state. A coercive state may be peaceable, but you've created a slave state. So,
yes.
That's not our goal in society, and that's what policing really is in a lot of ways. And again, I can just rant on and on about how we do things now. Yeah. Is incredibly destructive. So if you think, well, we got to arrest drug dealers. Okay. Well, how is that working out for you in our society? Well, it's not working at all. We've done it for 45 years. We have the world's largest prison population on the planet by a mile.
Travesty.
This cost. Oh, I don't want to pay for people's drug treatment. Okay, well, you're paying $50,000 a year to keep them incarcerated. But you're comfortable paying that.
Yeah.
And does that help them? Does that help society? They're getting back out again, don't you?
Right.
You've just locked, if they are this actual evil drug dealer, so you say, then, well, when they get out, what are they going to do? They're going to go right back to that business, and they're not going to want to go to jail again. And so they are going to take more risks. They're going to be more violent. They're more likely to shoot someone else or shoot a cop or something like that. And so you've made it more dangerous. And with kids with drugs, I'm telling you, if you think you are protecting kids by keeping drugs illegal, you are wrong. And for the very kids, you actually kind of make it more attractive to them with a whole forbidden fruit type angle. And also for kids, you talk about marginalized kids and particularly, minority kids that's in poor communities that that the cops are out busting on the street selling dope. Well, let me tell you, those kids get sucked into that because of the prohibition that we have created.
Right.
That's an entirely a creation of the prohibition market that gets the kids involved. They're targeted specifically by drug dealers to work for them. They put them on the street because those kids are disposable. They're a little, barrier between the cops and the dealers. The kids like it because they're getting paid something or whatever, and it's kind of fun. You play cops and robbers when you're a kid. When you get a little bit older, cops and robbers, they get a little excitement out of it, and they can consider themselves, operators or whatever they want to call.
Right.
But it's that whole market. And I mean, are those kids on the street? Are they selling pints of liquor on the street? Have you ever seen that happen?
No.
Kids selling mini balls. No.
I haven't personally.
Yeah. Have you ever seen drive-by shootings between beer distributors?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay. Yeah. Imagine that. Same substances, that are just as addictive and destructive, relatively speaking. Yeah, we don't have kids selling them. We don't have this entire criminal gang organizations distributing them. We don't have the shootings. We don't have the extortions. We don't have the murders. We don't have all of that. It's because it's legal.
Yeah. We've made one respectable and one not.
Right.
And so therefore you should pay with your life in, a rape cage for that. And that's one of the things that makes me the most angry. And I think I'm really passionate myself about the role of police in our society. And there's so much. I'm sort of the same. There's a lot we could talk about. But one of the things that I really, really gets me angry, and it's really anger, is when people are like, well, they did the crime, they should do the time. And it doesn't matter if they're 14 and they sold those drugs, they should go to adult prison. And I'm like, you are setting, even young men who are in their 20s are not safe in these jails and prisons. That, if you want to talk about rape culture, that's where your rape culture is. I would love, I know it's very difficult to do a study in that way, but I am of the belief, and this is just a personal belief, that there are more rapes happening in those kinds of institutions, detention facilities, jails, and prisons than all across the free country. So I think that's really terrible that you're saying, I'd rather your son be traumatized for selling my son a marijuana cigarette, a joint, than I'd rather him go and be raped because he did something that I see as, it's terrible. And not just raped, even if they avoid the rape, there's so much victimization in there. It is amazing to me. And then also, like I said, I know a lot of cops. When the cop will sit and watch his family member smoke marijuana at his home and throws people in a cage for doing the same thing. That to me is the utmost, that's just vile. And I see it a lot. You see these, police benevolent society, the courtesy cards or whatever they are, they hand to people, and so you can get out of your ticket because your dad's a cop. They're a special class, and they're the biggest bunch of entitled people that you will ever meet. They feel like they're entitled to your respect, for your obedience, for you to let them do what they want. And I'm getting worked up, I can tell. It drives me nuts. It really does, because it's so not what they're supposed to be. And they want to be respected as if they hold this high standard, and yet they don't want to actually hold that high standard.
Yeah, exactly. And a couple of things we talk about, well, if you can't do the crime, can't do the time, don't do the crime.
Ugh.
And see, that's our tire that we have a law enforcement community. We have law enforcers.
No peace officers.
Well, if your goal is law enforcement, then, well, I guess we've done one of the greatest jobs ever. Now, if that's your goal, then great. Now, if your goal is a peaceable society, if your goal is the absence of crime and disorder, which is one of Sir Robert Peel's 9 principles of policing, the evidence of, your production is the absence of crime and disorder, not your physical presence in dealing with it. So this whole idea of law enforcement is so just destructive.
Yes.
If you consider yourself like a peace officer, what is your goal? Your goal is to have a peaceful and stable society. Then what you're doing is 100% opposite of that, because those people you incarcerate, again, you traumatize them, you instill learned helplessness into them, you institutionalize them, you've ostracized them to the point where they couldn't become a productive member of society no matter how hard they try. It's not happening.
You stigmatize their whole life.
You stigmatize. and see, I go back to, well, you basically kidnapped a person for adult consensual activity when they harmed no one. They used violence against no one. And so be careful for using that, because you may get measured and judged spiritually and morally. You'll have an accounting for those actions as well.
Right. I was
be careful.
I'm sorry, last night I was just reading a few statistics that I came across when I'm just looking into some stuff. And one of the things was that I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think it was either 6 out of 7 or 6 out of 8 arrests for drug crimes are not for selling drugs. They're for possessing drugs, which you went to what you said earlier about that. And that there are more people in the United States incarcerated in pre-trial detention than most other countries have in their whole jail system.
We would have to, yes, we would have to reduce our prison population by 80%. We would have to let 80% out just to equal the average incarceration rate in Europe and Canada.
Yeah, and
so we'd have to let 80% out. So that's just that's a good measure of just how distorted our system is.
And you were talking about children, and that's the other thing with kids. Like you take these kids who don't have a lot of opportunities, who we've created the incentive for them to sell these drugs because they can make a lot of money. Yeah, and so then we punish them, and I'm really disturbed by the amount of children. One of the statistics I read last night was like almost 11,000 kids are in detention facilities for things that aren't even really crimes. I'm still looking into that. I'm not sure how they can hold so. It's like truancy or something. I don't know. I'm not sure what those things are, but that was the statistic. And I need to do a little further research, but I've been seeing a lot of police called to schools on like 6-year-olds or 11-year-olds and for doing nothing. I remember a article from Pennsylvania a year or two ago where a little boy said something about a brownie that this girl had brought to school, and she happened to be black, and the teacher took it as a racist remark and called the police. And the police came to the school, and like every interaction, the statistics are that I think it's like you're 4 times more likely with every interaction with the police when you're young to go to jail. Like it's not, it's amazing to me that people think that small children, even teenagers, need interaction with the police in order to do well. What they need is to not have interaction with that kind of scary authority that wears a gun and could hurt you and be, it's okay. Like what do you think is causing that, where people are calling the police in elementary schools?
Amazing, isn't it?
It's mind-boggling.
Well, that's, one thing I noticed as a cop, and that why I would get upset when people, back in the day when I'd say people would be blaming cops on so much we did, I'd get mad and say, you know what? It's the community calling us.
Right.
Say, well, you're just locking up black folks or whatever. And they go, okay, well, let's see where our calls of service are from. And, that's where we're going. But we also, you've had it for years. If you have a dispute, call 911. Call 911. Don't handle it yourself.
Right.
Call the cop. And so we've instilled this learned helplessness, I would say, and I think that has kind of been intentional. Over the decades, you call the police for, and you sit
right.
Call the police for anything, and you sit in dispatch and you hear about surly dispatchers and stuff. Man, if you sat in there and heard the crap that people call them up for,
yeah,
and oh my gosh, I mean,
chicken nuggets and
oh yeah, I had tons of disputes between neighbors or fast food restaurants where people would actually call the cops over stuff like this.
Wow.
And it was it's insane and mind-boggling. So it's a lot of the responsibility on the community, but it creates that where disputes can only be handled by police. People won't handle it themselves.
They don't learn how to negotiate. Like you.
Right. And then in the schools, the same thing. I think that's why a lot of the reason why police are there is to get kids comfortable with that. And they've said that's the stated reasons for SRO programs and that type of thing anyway, is for people to get comfortable with law enforcement. And so you see the law enforcement in schools and what they do. They don't have to be, arresting a bunch of kids, which they do that. And we did as well, just for lots of little charges and stuff that should be handled otherwise. It would become criminal matters. But you're just there. You have cops there telling, hey, where's your ID? Show me. And it's on a lanyard on the kid's back, but you have cops stopping.
Right.
Where's your ID? You're late for class. Stop right there. You're now a threat.
Right.
I mean, this is actually how the kids get treated.
Yeah, they become institutionalized, like the
school clothing, codes where you have, and I mean, some kids wear some stupid stuff to school that they probably shouldn't be there, but you have a cop that's there. Oh, your shorts are too short. Stop right here, Missy. And, and like now they're again in a coercive, confrontational setting. And then when you have these code red drills and these active shooters and these school lockdowns, these are just trauma infliction rituals. Again, learned helplessness, traumatization. Yeah. That's what they're for.
And fear.
And it gets cops acclimated to think that that's their job, is quote unquote protecting kids by roaming the hallways of schools. Where's your ID?
Right. Unless there's an active shooter and then they stay outside. Right. Like that's those vile, despicable humans.
And say, well, we have no liability. There's no
mandate to protect.
No mandate for us to respond to any specific or situation or protect any specific citizen, just in a general sense. That Supreme Court says. And this has been going on for decades, and this is kind of how the police think. We're not doing anything wrong. We're just there at the school.
Yeah, and it's really disingenuous for them to, on one hand, want to spend their time and think that, having a police in the school to look and see whether or not, Johnny's got his belt, on and his pants aren't pulled down past his crack, and then to say, like, just happened here recently in Tennessee, last week, I think it was on Tuesday, myself and a bunch of other libertarians, Libertarian Party members, things like that, were going to go to the State House, and they were going to hear the equitable sharing bill that was coming up to end equitable sharing in Tennessee. And of course, the police called and the whore politicians whored themselves out to the police once again. And they backed it off. They took that off the docket. And so they didn't even hear it. And I think it's disingenuous for them because they said, well, we can't, if we don't have this civil asset forfeiture money, we can't police child sex trafficking and illegal immigration. It's funny that they mentioned those two things, right? Like it's the two issues.
That's the new hot button.
Yes, always for the children, and then now it's immigration. So they didn't do that, but they want to say they can spend their time and resources in a school, but they can't spend their time and resources on real crime, like child sex trafficking, and that they have this amazing foresight that they know what they're going to be having to police. Like I know that there's going to be speeders, so I need to get them, but I'm not going to be able to police this if I'm doing that. Like I just find it really, really terrible. And they were just outed a few years ago anyways here. They had been taking civil asset forfeiture money and having big parties and stuff. So now they're going to say that they need it for police work. Like, it's just so, it's like they've been given a license to be corrupt, and they're okay with that because they benefit from the corruption. And they're like, well, we're heroes, so we should get some benefits, right? We don't get paid very much. And well, there's all these kind of mental gymnastics you can do to make it okay. But if you get right back down to basics of what even they would probably say, most police officers would say that they believe they are way outside any moral standard that they would pretend to hold. And yet there they are doing it. But it's because that power corrupts, right? And they have this power that has corrupted them. And so, you may be a good person. You may go to church every Sunday or do whatever you do, go feed the homeless. But if you're willing to, take money from people, rob them on the side of the road, be road pirates, then for something they haven't even been convicted of yet, right? Like, that's the thing a lot of people often miss when they talk about civil asset forfeiture, is that these people have not been convicted of a crime. And often they are told, look, you can fight this, but you're going to get arrested if you don't. You have to sign right now that you're not going to fight this, and we take your money and it's just done. Or you'll get sent the summons, and then you're going to have to be arrested at that point, and then you can plead your case. So, if that's not strong-arming someone, I don't know what is.
Right. And so, I think of myself, as that new cop that consider myself, Christian conservative, got a degree in criminal justice, and you're looking at civil asset forfeiture laws, and you're like, how in the world is that constitutional? I mean, it's just any basic, and I'm no fan of the Constitution, but any base of it, you're like, this is blatantly unconstitutional.
Right.
I mean, but no, Supreme Court says it's cool. I remember one day sitting with a fellow cop of mine, and we're going through and I was not ever on like narcotics teams or anything like that. We were looking at one of the just little magazine, it was narcotics officers of America kind of bulletin thing, and they're showing all this across America stuff that cops cash had seized, and we're reading the little reports, and they're like, cop seized $1,000 from this person, no drugs detected, but they got the money. And I remember my friend, and he was a Marine and a former Marine and kind of cop, and he's like, wow, we can really do that? And he's like, that just doesn't seem right. I'm like, yeah, and here I'm the smarter one who got my college degree, and I'm like, oh yeah, they can do it. The Supreme Court case, blah blah blah, says it's okay.
Must be right.
So it must be right. And we're like, wow, that's kind of crazy, but they do it, and so cops do it, and they again. They think, well, it's legal, so it must be okay. And then they get brainwashed into and you hear all the civil asset forfeiture cops go, it's a good tool.
Right.
They'll say that. And so that is something that has been brainwashed into them. So whenever they say that, they're not, that's not their own thoughts.
Yeah.
And it's a whole system. And see, this has been pushed down through the federal government and what I call a backdoor way to federalize local law enforcement.
Yeah.
So a lot of the drug war and drug enforcement has been a way to divert resources from like actual crime, Sherry, that we were talking about earlier, into these systems. And so they get these drug interdiction systems. And that's the newest thing now is Homeland Security and, immigration and, human trafficking to get cops into this system. And you know what? Last time I was in Pigeon Forge on vacation, they were holding at the same hotel I was at. There was a bunch of Tennessee law enforcement guys doing civil asset forfeiture training, and they got good and liquored up every night, drunk off their asses, and drunk in the elevator. I'll never forget. These guys were the most unprofessional core of dudes, and you could tell these are all career cops, but they were doing training on how to pull over cars and what paperwork to go through to seize money.
Wow.
And see, cops, and also they'll say, well, we're not taking them from innocent people. You say, well, we afford a process, and cops, they're convinced, if I'm dealing with you, you're guilty.
Right.
They create that in their mind. So if you tell them, you're taking this stuff from innocent people, and he'll go, no, I know he's a drug dealer.
Right.
Well, drug dealing should not be a crime, and it's this whole prohibition thing is all stuff that you kind of is a reaction to what you've created anyway.
Right.
Go ahead with all that, and again, they're just straight taking money. They know it. The politicians are finally maybe kind of coming around to it.
If that were true though, and they I know they in a shallow way maybe believe it, they just say it, but if you really think about it, if this person is a drug dealer, right, a really bad guy, this drug dealer, and you're just okay with just taking their money, like wouldn't you want to put them in jail? Like they haven't been convicted of anything yet, and you're just going to take their money, and they're not going to, like, wouldn't you really want that to happen if that's the case? If you really want to do good, like if they're just going to go out and earn more and sell more drugs.
In some ways, in not necessarily civil asset forfeiture, but I did this as a cop, just with tickets and stuff that I would write to people. Is so what you can do, and this kind of helps justify what you're doing to someone. So I would write people tickets, and then arrest them or whatever. And then when they come to court and all, you can dismiss it. And, or just, not kind of push forward through it or whatever. And that way I arrested them, and, how they say, you can beat the rat, but you can't beat the ride. So I taught them a lesson. I hassled them. I cost them a lot of time and money. And then I can consider I can look like a good guy at the end of the day. Well, let me just, let me
pat yourself on the back.
Yeah. Or, I'm glad you're here and you're whatever, you straighten yourself up or whatever. So, we'll just make this go away. And so the law enforcement does the same thing too, is, we'll take their money, but then we're saving the taxpayers' money by not arresting them or anything because nothing happens to them anyway.
Right.
This all, this kick in the ground kind of thing.
Right.
But it becomes a process, and see, they're making money, and wouldn't that be fun? You could get your own Tahoe.
Exactly.
With strobe lights and tinted out.
Yeah.
You could get you a dog, and who doesn't love dogs, Sherry?
Me.
And you could get a gun, and you could run up and down the highways doing 90 miles an hour, pulling people over and checking them and playing all that coy little game.
Or on their cell phone.
To talk to them back and forth to get them to consent to search.
Right.
And if you find something, it's like fishing or hunting.
Right.
It's fun. Yeah, I got one today, and
gives you a story to tell.
You pat yourself on the back, and that's a good way to make a living. That's you get that adrenaline rush. You can feel like you did something. You're riding up and down the highway, speeding, this and that. You're not in an office. You got a dog with you. What a ton of fun! Yeah,
you're almost like an independent contractor, right? You just kind of drive around and do what needs to be doing, but most of the time
you got to be earning too.
Yeah, exactly.
So you got to flow over people and get those. And so, you do have to earn. Well, what did you get? We have you specifically assigned to pull over, for narcotics interdiction. What have you got? And you end up with trash arrest. So you make, I got one today. It's
right, just so that you can.
I got a bitch. It was the smallest fish, but I got it.
Wow.
So that's what they count. It goes down as a check. I got that arrest. I got that interdiction. And so again, with no accountability. That's inherent with government, and when you're paid through forced taxation and any policies and procedure manuals, you write them yourself, and the court, and even the Supreme Court, when you have use of force actions, that the court will say, was this police officer's, where he shot the dog and the homeowner at the wrong house? Was this objectively reasonable action of a police officer? And how does the Supreme Court know if it's objectively reasonable? Well, they ask other cops.
Right.
What's your basic standard? Well, we wrote this really low standard, so magically out abracadabra, everything we do is justified.
Right.
Because, well, we wrote the policy specifically to justify even the most outrageous conduct.
The people who write the laws own the people who enforce the laws, who obey the people that write the laws. Like it's just a cycle that keeps going, and they can keep pushing off, their responsibility.
The cops, they say like, well, hey, we're following policy. We have communities begging us, hey, get these drugs off the streets, which they are, they do cause problems. It's the prohibition that causes the problem, not necessarily the substance. So they're in it too, and plus they're getting paid for it. And then you have this billion-dollar, Department of Justice and institutional organizations and pharmaceutical industry and all of this other just entire systems that have been going for decades to propagandize everyone to think this is what you should be doing. And if you imagine you are that narcotics officer or that cop, and so I want to be a cop. I want to do good stuff. So you get out there, you like your friend. He's been a cop for a couple of years now, right? So he's dedicated, his whole life, or at least his career path. This is my career path, is to become a law enforcement officer. Oh, there's that word again. So you become a law enforcement officer, and you go through the training. You get in there, and you spend a couple of years, and you start to kind of see that it's not what you thought. And now everything you've tried to do is legal. You're not an off the chain cop or anything like that. And you see, hey, this isn't right.
Okay.
What do you do then? Now you're going to come home and tell your wife and your kid, and you got the car payment and the house payment, and you're going to tell your wife, well, this career path I chose that I really begged you to let me do. Well, it's, I want to quit for these nebulous integrity, moral kind of reasons that I really can't articulate very well, and I would like to quit.
Not going to go over too well usually. Yeah, there's so much I wanted to talk to you about still. I'd love to have you on again. I know we've come sort of to the end of our time. And I didn't even get to, how you got to be a voluntarist, which I think is a huge jump. And, I understand it because I went through that, where I was a completely different person and looked at the world in a completely different way. And, sometimes it's amazing to me that anyone can change that much. And so I think, well, if I did it, other people have done it. And anyways, I wanted to talk to you about that, but we're out of time. But I did want to ask you one last thing. And that is, if you could make an appeal to your, the police officers as a former police officer yourself, because, often military and police don't respect civilians because we haven't done the job and we don't know how hard it is and all that crap. So what would your appeal be to them, if you could make one? What would you say to someone who's a police officer at this point?
Well, it's hard to talk right at them.
Yeah.
You kind of got to let them pull their own path. I know that. So, I would just tell cops, look, the United States, and that's you, currently has the world's highest incarceration rate by a mile. We arrest more people. We incarcerate them more often and for longer than any country on the planet. And that is not right. And you look at this country, the most powerful country in the world, and you are an armed government enforcer on their behalf. And through the entire country's history, it has been, and the government and its agents, which is you, throughout its entire history, has always been perpetuating some type of massive injustice, with slavery or Native Americans, or, you have Jim Crow and all these other codes, or even like prohibition, just these massive forced hospitalization and sterilization of people, just lots of things, lots of injustice that police officers have perpetuated. So why do you think that you're at some point in history where you're not actively participating in something? Most powerful government in the world. there's not anything that maybe is considered legal that is immoral and unjust that you should not be participating in. Something, think about that. And if you find one thing, then why is it wrong? What criteria are you using to say, hey, this law is legal? Civil asset forfeiture is one of them. And it's even constitutional, but it is in fact wrong. So what process did you come to finding that it's wrong? And maybe you should apply that process to some other things you do and just kind of pull on that thread. And you are personally responsible. You think you're responsible for all the good that you do, personally responsible.
Right.
Well, you're personally responsible for any harm that you may inflict on others in service to the government. Okay. And so you got to think about that and make those choices.
That's great. I think that's a brilliant point that, you want to be thanked for the good you do, but you don't want to be responsible for the bad. Isn't that kind of a double standard? And
yeah, how does that work?
Yeah, it's amazing.
When is it okay to use force against another man? When is that okay? What guidelines do you use? Is it just legality and police procedure? Is there something bigger than that? Maybe moral or ethical considerations. How does your badge? How is something like if Raeford Davis, the citizen, went to a stranger's home across town and kicked in their door, right, because they've got weed, or even they've got meth, even evil, scary stuff. If I kicked in their door, took their belongings from them, shot them if they resisted me, would that be okay for me to do?
Right.
And so if that's not okay for me as a citizen, then and citizens don't have that right, how was that right transferred to you?
Right.
When even the citizens did not have it in the first place. And the answer is you don't have that right.
Yeah. A great point. That's great. So is there anywhere where people can, I follow you on Twitter. I know you're on there. Do you have a website or anything else
that
people can find you on?
Raeford D. So you can find me there. I've put up a few articles. Two of my favorites are at the Libertarian Institute.
Okay.
With the great
Scott Horton.
Those guys up there. Murder in the Service of the Drug War, and Disposable Veterans and Moral Injury. So if you're going to read two articles from me, go read those two. Murder in Service of the Drug War and Disposable Veterans and Moral Injury at Libertarian Institute. Yeah, and I'm on Twitter, so you can find me on there, and I've done a few podcasts here and there as well.
Right, yeah, I know you've been on Pete. It's still hard for me to call him Pete. I always tell him when I'm like messaging him, I'm like, I always put it in quotation marks because it's just wrong. But yeah, I've been on Free Man Beyond the Wall like 4 or 5 times now. I think it's been quite a few, but this is great. I'm just so, I'm really thankful that you're doing what you're doing.
And Sherry, I just listened to your podcast with is it Jason Bressler from Free Thought Project.
Yeah.
They do such a great job.
It's
interesting how, they've got taken off Facebook, and they've done a good job of exposing a lot of issues with our current society. So
yeah, that's he has done a fabulous job.
That you did.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. But yeah, I really admire what you're doing, because I know when we didn't get to talk about it today, but the pressure that's on police officers to, they pressure people to comply, but there's even more pressure on them to comply and to be part of that unit and not to break the brotherhood. They really personalize that to cops. That's why, when good cops start standing up against corrupt ones, then I'll give them a little bit of credit, but there aren't any. When they stand up, they get fired or they get, something like there's a lot of stuff that goes on. So, I really appreciate that you're speaking up, because this is not something that makes people like you. It's not something that, like, I know personally, it's not something when you talk about these things, these are the sacred cows of, most Americans, right? The police and the flag and, the Constitution, those things. And so when you say one of our heroes, our boys in blue, they're not doing the right thing, and we need to reform this, or their training is bad. Like, you can't even say the training is poor, and so cops are acting poorly because they're trained. Like, people, they don't even want to accept that. They want to accept, well, you know what, you wouldn't get hurt if you just did what the cop said, because it doesn't matter what the cop does. What it matters is that you do something to obey. And so what I was getting at with that was that, I just admire that you're speaking up about this, because you have a unique position that most of us don't have, to be able to speak to them with authority that they love so much, because you did it. And so, I just think that's just an invaluable resource, to the voluntarist community, that you're an invaluable resource. So I certainly appreciate you coming on today, and hopefully we can do it again. This is a great conversation, and when I'd like to have more and talk about these other 50 things that I didn't get to.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Sure, great. All right, guys, that's it for me this week. Follow Raeford on Twitter, and you said that's Raeford. It's Raeford Davis, right? At Twitter.
Raeford D.
Raeford D. So go follow him on Twitter. You'll be glad you did. Till next time, peace.